Yes. Wow, that's nice to hear. Okay, there we go. So welcome everybody for this second part of the demonstration with the biography of Holly, who is so kind to participate in this demonstration. So welcome, Holly, and nice to have you back again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to do sort of a track and trace through Holly's fourth house triad, and we're going to evaluate it by means of the things that I demonstrated in previous videos about this zodiacal releasing from spirit method, which I call track and trace, because we're now going to try to differentiate the specific periods under a major period and what these might suggest as happening to a person or turning up in life as a person go through each of these periods. So as I said, each house triad can be evaluated by means of the idea of a sowing, growing, and harvesting period, which is in this case the fourth house triad of Holly. And I'm going to illustrate the focus periods and the turning points of each period. So let's dig into them. Okay, as a short recap of the previous period, I'm going to slow this down. I think this is better. Yeah. Okay. On the left hand of this slide, you can see the three periods I'm going to talk about, which is the lion period, which is the third house period, which precedes the fourth house period, of course, which is the second part of this fourth angular triad. And as I said, this is the sowing period, in this case, the lion period of Holly's chart, because that's the one preceding the fourth house, and that's the sowing period. And then we get to the action period, which is sort of conceptualized as a growing period in which the specific things belonging to this fourth place are highlighted again. And then in the last period, which is the period of the scales, Libra, this is the succeeding place to the fourth house angular triad, which sort of suggests a harvesting period in which everything that was experienced in the previous periods gets sort of an end result or sort of a harvest for digesting perhaps everything that happened before and using it to move on in life. And that can be either applause for stuff that you have learned or stuff that you have integrated into your life, or perhaps it can be when you have a bad, sort of a bad how do you call it, a bad play going on in the fourth house period, then perhaps that the last period, the harvest period, is perhaps less productive or less good in your life. But good and bad are really relative words, relative concepts in these cases, because we move through a lot in our life, and I'm hoping these periods can show that for Holly's chart. So, okay, let's have a look at that. Again, as I said, the interesting thing about these angular triads is that the angle itself is often the principle which is actually very important for the whole set of three images that a person goes through. And please understand that the length of these periods can be very different between this chart and another one. So for instance, here you see that the middle part, the Virgo period, is actually the longest one, which is 20 years. And the harvesting period from Libra, the scales, is pretty short. It's only 8 years, but that's how it is. That's our fate, right? Some things last a long time, and some things only a short while. And depending on what planets are in there and what planets are ruling these periods, that's of course very important for evaluating what's going on in these periods. Okay, so when this fourth house triad is actually the main theme of all the complete periods of these three images, let's have a look at what that might suggest as what's going on in these sowing, growing, and harvesting periods. Now, Vege's Valens is, of course, a primary source for me on this. And he actually mentions quite a few topics for the fourth place, the father, the children, that's one's own woman, and older persons, one's own woman. These recipes were, of course, written for male astrologers, not for women. So I'm not quite sure what this might suggest for a chart belonging to a female person, as Holly is. What one does has to do with profession, the city where you live, household, possessions, etc. Abiding means where you live, your home. Retribution is sort of something that comes back in your life. I'm not quite sure what this might mean in this case. I think modern astrologers might suggest that it has something to do with karma or something like that. Changes of place. We heard in the previous video that in the first period, Holly moved, I believe, 11 times. She moved house, so that's quite a lot. But indeed, changes of place were in order in these periods. Death, the grave, has a meaning for the fourth place, etc. And also, Valens says that the third place is goddess, and which has a specific signification for the mother. So let's have a look at the separate periods, and then I'll leave to Holly to inform us about all the things that happened in these periods. So sort of the central theme, because fourth is the Cantron, relates to these three periods, and this is what Vege's Valens says about them. So let's have a look at them. Okay. As I said before, we will be focusing on the turning points and the focus periods, and I will start with finding a life work, the first one. Okay. So, okay. I call this track and trace because what you need to do is for each period, you need to simply track in which of these L2 under periods, the minor periods of these longer periods under a major period. For instance, in this case, the lion has 19 years, and these 19 years are subdivided into specific periods as per images. And well, you need to track and trace which of these sub-periods are highlighted in some way. And the first manner of highlighting this is, of course, trying to find the ruler of the daimon, which is in this case the sun. So we need to look at the first period when Holly was 6 years old. She had her first encounter with the ruler of her daimon, which is the sun, because her daimon is in the lion. That's interesting because, as I said as I show in this black box, there you can see that it's also possible a moment of recognition, because the sun is also the first triplicity ruler, and it's ruled by the second triplicity ruler, which is Jupiter. So that's very interesting, and it's also a defining event. So, but of course, Holly was very young at the day. So, do you remember anything about this period, Holly?
Yeah, I was looking at the dates on that. So actually, when that began, I wasn't even 6 yet. I was still 5.
Okay.
That's January 23rd, right? 1968.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So I think I would have probably, during that period, I started school. I started kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
So, that.
Okay.
That's what stands out to me. And then, of course, during that period, my sister was born. That event stands out to me.
Okay.
And I think we moved one of those.
One of the transitions of that,
yeah.
One of the many transitions in the period. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. So I've also written down what Holly mentioned, because Holly was um, smart enough to keep sort of a record of things happening in our life, which is a very good advice for everybody trying to work with this method. It's a very good idea um, to um, to make a record of things you remember as happening in your life in certain periods. I believe I showed before that I do this in Excel. I simply map out the year and the months, and then when something happens, be it either big or small, I put it in the Excel document, and then I have a nice record of things happening, and they become denser as I grow older, simply because because the things that happened long ago, and I was not an astrologer in those days, so some of these things stand out, but many of these early years are a bit empty. But the more I get in this period of my life, the more dense the notations get. But it's an interesting thing to use for this study. So yeah, you said it was perhaps a better period because your sister was born and you were excited about it and you started school or kindergarten. Of course, I must say that the Stoics were of the opinion that a person becomes sort of self-motivated around the age of 14. So I'm not quite sure. I believe Vetjes Valens said that for children, we need to use the zodiacal releasing from fortune for the first 14 years.
Oh, okay.
uh, to perhaps get a better glance of what's happening, simply because as a child things happen to us and we're not that free to go our own way. And
we don't really have our own agency, do we?
Right. That's exactly. So, okay, let's have a look at the other period. Well, if we look at this period, when you were, I believe you were 22 at that age. Again, you encountered the bowman, the image of the bowman for 12 months. It's always a year because it's the bowman, and the ruler of the bowman is Jupiter, which has 12 months in these sub-periods. So again, a year of perhaps finding a life work. And do you remember anything about this period?
Yeah, I didn't have any notes on that, but I do recall that would have been, I was still in almost graduated from college. So, yeah, you are, that's exactly what you're doing. You're trying to find your life's work when you're, I think, during that period.
Do you remember, perhaps this is also choosing a further education, which is always in line with trying to decide what kind of work you want to do in life?
Well, that was still that was the undergraduate degree. So I was still working on that, almost completed.
Okay.
Let's see, I'm trying to think what else. I actually worked for a university at that time too.
Okay.
So.
Interesting. Okay, so that it was related to work in a sort of a sense, but yeah, okay. Well, as I said in another video, the life work, in my case, it was very strongly associated with trying to think about a sort of an aspiration for I want to become this or I want to become that. So in my case, it was I wanted to become a musician. Sorry, and well, it's and it's not always strongly related, perhaps, to finding a vocation. Sometimes it's also simply something turning up in life, which becomes a life work simply because it's important to work through it or work with it. So it's more an abstract sense of a life work. But
I'll tell you something else that stands out now that I think about it. It was during those years in college. My major was journalism and government. But during that journalism, some of the classes, I took my first photography class. So that's when I actually learned how to operate a camera manually and know everything about it. So thinking, that does kind of tie in with some stuff we might talk about later. But
oh, that's great, because indeed we will later see that photography was a very big positive influence in you.
That was like a light bulb going off, like I really like this.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really very interesting in this period.
Yeah.
It really ties into the essence of what a life work is, and we don't always see the major importance of it, but it turns up for the first time. So that's great. That's nice to hear. Yeah. Okay. You had no notes on that period, but this was very important information. So thank you. Yeah. Okay. Next period. Oh no, there's another one. I use that one simply because, of course, this your lion period under the Virgo period is, of course, a period where the diamond itself is activated, because your lot of diamond, a lot of spirit is in the lion. So at age 34, perhaps there was also something going on having to do with finding your way in life or being inspired by something.
Yeah, I don't believe I've got anything on. I can't really think of anything that stands out at that time.
Well, it could also be Mars, and Mars is, of course, a very interesting planet in your life.
It sure is.
Right. We're going to see about that. Okay, that's okay. We perhaps, Well, the interesting thing is when I started doing this method, some memories came back simply because I was forced to somehow evaluate things with these planets, as I'm doing now with Holly's chart. It was interesting that some memories came back. That was a very interesting thing to notice. So perhaps this will happen as well as we talk, as you did with the previous period, and you suddenly remembered that photography. You learned to use a camera. So yeah. Stuff like that, but this is okay. Let's have a look at the third period, because then again at age 41, again you were in a Bowman period, the Sagittarius, the Archer, and there again we see the Sun, the ruler of your diamond. Perhaps again it might have been an interesting phase in your life, because this was a relatively good one for you, this third period.
I don't recall. Yeah.
It's okay. It's
That's
okay.
3 for 3.
But
I do have plenty of others. I don't know. It must not have been anything horrible that stood out to me at that time. I do believe those were good years,
Yeah. You mentioned in the previous video that this was a period in which you really found sort of your work as a photographer, and that was quite successful.
In general, during this period, yes.
Right,
but that Sagittarius period, I can't specifically say anything that...
I must say that in my own experience, I came to believe that when persons do not have a very specific memories of something big happening, that might have to do with the fact that when this happens in a first period in life, under the first major period of zodiacal releasing, and that is a long period, as it was in my case, because in my case it was the Capricorn, which was the first. No, it was the water bearer, the Aquarius period in my life, which is 30 years.
Wow.
When it then happens, when then the ruler of the diamond is activated, I think that the impact is bigger, because that's the planet also ruling the set period. So I'm guessing that this might be an explanation why some things, these periods might not really stand out in a big way. So yeah, that might be the case here. So yeah, well, we learn through with this method as well. We learn through using it and trying to understand why is this not such an important period, or of sparking big memories. So
not that particular, not that particular, but there's other ones in there that are.
Yeah. We're gonna look now. The second one is a loosings of the bond, which is also turning points and crisis and choices. The essence of losing of the bond is a sudden change, a diversion from the general character, etc., etc. That's a theory. I talked about it in a previous video, so let's have a look. So here we see the first one is under the first period, because the first period is 19 years long, and the months of all the images come to 17 years and something. I don't know exactly how many months, but 17 plus years. And because this period is longer, you get a loosening of the bond. So, and here we see the loosening of the bond going to Saturn. So Saturn now takes over from the lion from the sun. Sorry. So that's the change. Saturn takes over as the ruler of the period, the major chronometer, but they work together because they see each other, because they are in a sextile configuration with each other. They are sextile. So they see each other, and that means that they both are working together. So this was at age 18. Any specific memories about that?
Yeah, that was a difficult time, because I'm thinking when that period started, I was a junior in high school, and first major breakup, the first relationship, you know how that is. You think it's end of the world, and that happened during that same period. We moved again. My senior year, we moved, and I graduated from high school. I went off to college, and it just felt like a sense of abandonment. Is how, if I could choose one word, it was like you're just being thrown out there to your own, I don't know. That's how it felt for me. It was a difficult, a lot of adjustments and change. Oh, and there's Saturn in the 9th house of higher education. And that was, I felt very, at that particular school, just very alone, very detached, very separated, very,
that really describes Saturn, of course. Let's see, you have few memories, a new school, you wanted to fit in, worked hard for it, struggled to keep up, etc.
Right.
When we look at what Fallon says, he says it's from light into shadow. So what you described sort of highlighted that a bit. So these are very specific delineations supplied by Fallon's, but of course they do not always come out in such a great detail. But you described Saturn, and that's an interesting way of looking at what happened in this period, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's good. That description there is good.
Yeah. Okay. Second period. There's also because the Virgin distributes 20 years. So this must mean that again there is a loosening of the bond, and this one is from the Virgin to Pisces. This must have been sort of a somewhat better period, perhaps. And the reason is that now, of course, Jupiter is the planet which is the chronometer for this period. And this has always also a configuration with the major period, so they were working together. And Jupiter also is the second triplicity ruler, and it's in the 10th place. So this ought to be quite a boost for perhaps this period. I'm not sure if you can recall anything about it.
Yeah. When I talked about finding life's work maybe happening at the beginning of that third period, that Libra period, actually, it really started here in 1999 when Jupiter's up there in Pisces. That was the first where it came into, an idea that really, it really started then.
You mean the photography?
That's when the idea first came, the notion that that it actually started towards the tail end of 99.
Okay.
So that, and it's interesting that Jupiter's up there in the 10th.
Yeah. A big bonus.
And then some other things. I just was real involved in our church, in our community. That seemed to be a big focus during that time.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Let me just show what you said. You were
Yeah.
working for your dad. Oh, yeah. You had a steady job, I think,
Right, right,
which is, of course, something having to do with the 10th place in Jupiter, having a steady
right.
job, etc. Things going smoothly in that area of life. You lived in a small town. You wanted to fit in. Yeah. Okay. Community work, it's all Jupiter stuff. That's interesting. You attended church again, you got involved in, etc. That's interesting because Jupiter, of course, is the big benefic, and you having a day charter, which emphasizes the positivity of Jupiter, the day planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and the Sun itself. So this is an interesting
Well,
example of how this Jupiter might work. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
and I just thought of something else.
Yeah.
That
Tell
Jupiter,
me.
okay, so Jupiter rules that 7th, which is,
Yeah.
other people, partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
The Sun is in my 7th. So I'm thinking about my father and that working for him in this business.
Mm-hmm.
And also I formed a partnership with someone on this photography where we're going to do it together,
Okay.
so
Wow.
that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's a double-bodied image, right? The
Yeah.
Pisces. So,
Yeah.
and also the Bowman is also a double-bodied sign. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So this is what Valence says about it: a change of thing, innovations in activities. Well, that certainly is the case here. You started thinking about photography as a job, right? Okay. So okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's have a look at the third period, and because it's such a short period of only 8 years, there is no losing of the bond in this third period. Okay, let's have a look. Now, I need to say something about these 5 principles because I'm sort of tending to believe that these first 2 ones, the finding a life work and losing of the bond, are sort of generic. And the reason is that these principles happen only in certain images, and when they do, they follow a certain astrological principle. The other ones are more individual simply because the defining events strongly depend on where the planets are in a specific chart, and the turning points also, and the specific periods for this nativity alone are more, let's say, more personal for a certain chart. So finding a life road and losing the bond, of course, is also very personal, but they are sort of generic in the sense that they follow a certain logic in the what am I trying to say? The order of the images, how they manifest in this life, and the defining events, as we will see, are very specific for a certain for a specific chart, like the one from Holly. So that's something I think that's quite important. And now we come as actually sort of to the essence of important stuff happening in Holly's life, simply because these principles are working very specifically. They define certain periods of a major period. They point to turning points in these major periods, etc. So let's have a look at them. Now, the first period, of course, is the lion period, and then we have to look at the focus period, and this is a specific focus period. Why is that? Because we, of course, as we talked in the first presentation of this one, the first image that Holly goes through in life are the 19 years of the lion period, where we find Mars. The planet is in Leo, in the lion. So that means that whenever the other image of of Mars comes into place, then we have a certain focus period, simply because this planet is very important for the complete period, and now it sort of gets first stage in a sense. It comes on the scene as now it's my time. Now this is a Mars period. So when we come to the image of the Scorpion and of Aries, then important stuff happens. And there is a difference because in Scorpion we find Venus, and whenever we find a benefic in a certain image, the more severe stuff which might be going on is of course tempered, simply because Venus is a benefic planet. So um, and when you were 3 years old, the first one appeared, and the question is, oh my God, what happened? Because Mars is now the one ruling. So I'm guessing you might have moved house again or something like it. But
oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I know we did
okay.
move. You can say that for sure during that
Okay.
time, but although I don't really recall anything major,
okay.
I have thought often that something might have happened because looking at my progressed sun moved into Capricorn during that time.
Okay, yeah.
And that's a significant shift of energy, so who knows? I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, but that's a long time ago. And
right.
Okay, now then we move to the Aries period, because that's an important one, simply because we find a lot of fortune there. You were
oh wow, yeah,
11 years old. Yeah, because it's always something having to do with things befalling the native. That's what the signification of the lot of fortune is. So let's talk about the Aries period in this period.
Okay, so that is when we moved again. Okay. And I switched schools. We were still in the same town, but I had to switch schools, and this school just seemed a little bit behind, it wasn't challenging for me.
Okay.
I was totally bored. It was terrible.
Okay.
So that's one thing.
Okay.
My parents were on the verge of divorce.
Wow.
That was major. It was kind of like an upheaval, like, oh, am I going to have to move again? Where are we going? It just, my mother was having some issues, mental, like depression and things. She tried to overdose at one period. And also during this same period, there was a lot going on here in this Aries period. During the same time frame, she started talking about making a will. She involved me in it, asking my opinions as to, letting me know her wishes upon her death, what she would like. And I'm 12 years old during that time. Also, let's see, that same period, because during that same period, she actually does die. She commits suicide. Wow. So that was a tough period. That was a Mars period, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And Mars right on the IC,
Wow, yeah. Yeah, this is pretty shocking indeed.
Like I described that tower card, just everything is destabilized.
Yeah, wow. And have you got any memories about, because this must have been quite shocking and very distressing in this period. Have you any recollection of what happened shortly after that?
I just remember wanting to go back to school and I just wanted everything to be normal. I didn't want any tension or focus on, see, this probably would have been in that Taurus period then, right underneath the,
because it's her suicide, and it's very dramatic, of course, but it's really at the end of the Aries period, because it's just simply a few weeks, perhaps 1 or 2 weeks before.
Let's see, that period ended December 11th or 12th, I guess.
Yeah.
So, and then her death was December 3rd.
Yeah, right. Okay, so of course, listeners, Holly and I conversed about this, what's happening, and she allowed me to try to understand what happened in this period, especially the date of the suicide of her mother. So if it's okay, Holly, we can look at this now.
Sure.
Try to, thank you. So this is, I'm first going to do it with the zodiac releasing from the diamond, from spirit. But as Holly said, quite truly, of course, it's also perhaps something shown by the zodiac releasing from fortune. So I will be looking at that as well. But I will also try to make the listeners understand how you evaluate something like this, because there are some let's say habits going on when I read about zodiacal releasing in on Facebook pages and such. People are always trying to find peak periods, or trying to find specific things, or try to use transits or something to enhance what's already shown by this method alone. So I'm a strong advocate of using this method as a standalone. And of course, you can experiment with whatever you want to do. But I've found that this method in itself is very, very, how do you mean, very, very effective for trying to understand what's going on. So let me show you how I do this, because this is a very important principle of the logic of this method. So now this is the way these methods are notated, because we have a specific date, which is December the 3rd. And using the software Planet Dance, you can really focus on what are the L3 and the L4 periods. And these are, of course, dividing up these several periods into the first longest period is, of course, the one of Lion, which is in years, 19 years. And then you get to the L2 periods, which is years and months sometimes. That depends on the length of the month of each image. Again, the L3rd period is about months and weeks, and the last period is about days, as you can see. The Cancer period, the crab period of the 2nd of December, which is shortly before Holly's mother commits suicide, is simply several days, 6 days, simply because the crab has a long period of time to distribute. So this is how you notate, how the notation of these periods is. So whenever you talk to people about a specific date, please use this notation for. But this is the order in which these distributions go through the images and turn up at a certain date in a certain period of life. So whenever you have a specific event happening, use this. So let's have a look at how the logic of these periods for the event happening shows itself. Now, what I do in this table, what I show is what factors are involved in each image as we go through the L1, L2, L3, L4 period. So you can see that's quite a lot, because when you look at the Lion, you see that Mars is there. And that means that whatever you encounter next, it almost always has a certain relation with what's in the major period. And of course, the event happens in the last period. So what I do is that I try to understand what's going on, and I start always with the last period. So we have to start, in this case, for this event, we need to start with the crab. Because why is that important? Because we find that's the last image which signifies the event happening, which was the suicide of Holly's mother. Now, it's of course quite interesting that we find the moon as the ruler of that last period, because the moon always indicates the mother, of course. But when we go further, we see that the moon itself is square Mercury, which is in the 8th place. It's trine Saturn, which is the ruler of the 8th place. And we find that Venus, the dispositor of the moon, is in the Scorpion. Now, that itself ought to be very indicative of something bad happening in this case. It doesn't sound nice, but we know what happened, and you cannot say that anything nice was happening at that period. So when looking at Venus in Scorpion, and then try to look back, because we're talking about Mars, then we see that the 3rd period, the level 3 period of the water power, the ruler thereof is of course Saturn, which is opposing the first period of the lion, where we find Mars. And then we go to the L2 period, which is Aries, and Aries is of course ruled by Mars, and back to the first period we find Mars itself. So that's pretty interesting. So looking at Mars, starting with the last image in the row, there we find the moon, etc., etc. Applying with a sextile to Mars, that's also important, right? So an applying sextile means that it's going to happen. And also very interesting is the fact that Vetus Valens calls the 8th place from fortune, which is in this case the Scorpion, he calls also a place of death. So in Valens' method, he uses 2 houses that might signify bad things happening, having to do with death. It's the 8th place from the ascendant, which is in this case Capricorn, and Scorpion itself, because that is the 8th place from fortune itself. So yeah, you see all the principles having to do with death and with this very sad event having to do with the 8th place in more than one way. So, okay.
You know, even that Venus that's the ruler of the moon is not in a great sign.
It's,
you know, it's
right,
debilitated.
no, indeed, yeah. And
So.
because it's also in the place of death, according to Valens in this place, yeah. The interesting thing is that he also says that you see that fortune is in Aries, which is ruled by Mars, and the 8th place from there is also a Mars image. And Valens says, and I believe this is in book 2 of his anthology, he says that whenever that happens, these persons kill themselves. So what
really?
is the cause of death? The person itself. So that's really a very interesting take on this, what happened in your life.
Because it's the 8th place from fortune.
Right, and they are both ruled by Mars.
By Mars.
So, yeah, so he's pretty pretty forward about that. So, okay. So, well, this is the logic of this place. This Zodiacal releasing from spirit. So this is how the logic works. So whenever, again, I emphasize this for people listening, whenever you have an event in a certain date, don't try to pinpoint on focus period or whatever, in the sense that you have peak periods, because people are always referring to the fortune houses, etc. But when you follow the logic of this event by means of these separate distributions coming from a large period to the smallest period of time, then you will find a logic like this one. So,
and not that you could predict these details, but you can certainly see that it's challenging.
Right,
it's difficult.
Really, yeah. And I think it's pretty. I don't think many astrologers would ever try to predict death for somebody. So
no.
Okay, now let's have a look at the zodiacalism from fortune. Actually, we have sort of the same sort of principles, but these are also very telling, because here we have the first period is Aries, the second one is Capricorn, the 8th place. The third period is Scorpio, that's the 8th place again from fortune. And then in the last period we come to the water bearer, which has Saturn in it, which rules the 8th place. So interesting. Okay, let's have a look again. Again, we were going to work backwards. And again, you see the logic here. We start looking at Mars again. Why? Because the first period is Aries. So Mars is a major player in this complete sequence. So yeah, looking at Mars again, the last image in the row is the water bearer, where we find Saturn, which is in opposition to Mars. Okay, that's pretty evident. The L3 period is the one of Scorpion, the place of death via fortune, as Valens had it, ruled by Mars, the ruler of the major period, and Mars is again in opposition with Saturn. So, okay. And the level 2 period was the Capricorn, that's the 8th place of death, with Saturn again, the ruler, in opposition to the etc. etc. This is, I think, this pretty obvious how this all relates to each other and has to do with the principle that was going on and the event happening. So
well, the L4 period, the December 3rd is the exact day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true.
That she died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I didn't even notice that, but yeah, it's really on spot on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Again, you see the logic of this zodiacal releasing stuff. So, okay, now there's something more, because I think, well, okay, we have looked at Mars. Now let's look at Saturn, because of course Saturn is the ruler of the period, the last period in this sequence. And of course, the logic will be again pretty logic, simply because these are the factors having to do with each other. So it's all about Saturn and Mars in this case. So that's interesting, right? Again, the logic is pretty straightforward, I think. So, okay. Well, thank you for letting me do this, because I think this is a very important principle for people wanting to learn the method of zodiacal releasing. Whenever there are events, train yourself in using this way of trying to see the logic of why these periods follow up on each other and why they seem so logical for the event happening. So, and also that's pretty okay. Back to our focus points and turning points. So the second period, which is of course the fourth house itself, again we can find defining events and turning points. The defining event is simply because we encounter the Lord of the major period, which is in Capricorn, and of course Hermes, Mercury, rules the entire period of the Virgin. So that's the first one. At age 23, there's a defining event. Is there something standing out for you?
Let's say that's that Virgo period in the Capricorn. Yeah, divorce.
Okay.
Yeah. What else do you say?
Okay. I
but it was very difficult.
Yeah. A sense of suffering, and also a stressful period. Yeah. Thanks to the 8th place, right? And
it was like a death. It was like a death.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
That's how it felt.
Pretty intense. Yeah. Okay. And age 31, because then we get to the Gemini, and of course that's a turning point. Why? Because we come to the other domicile of Hermes, Mercury.
Gemini. And that's in 1993.
Yeah, that's when it started, and it lasts for quite a long time, right? So before you explain what perhaps you remember about it happening, people must understand that these are periods and these are quite long. So try not to focus on the date itself, but simply try to see it as a period which lasts a long time, because in this case, the Gemini has 20 months to distribute. So that's quite a long time. Yeah. Okay. Any ideas?
Virgo. Well, I'm looking at my notes, and I didn't have anything for that period.
Okay.
But it's Gemini. I don't know.
Now, to me, you said I bought a house, and I moved in the same town, and my grandfather died. And
in 93. Yeah, because it would be 93 and 94. That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So your grandfather died.
Yes.
Mercury, the 8th place, you got an inheritance, which is
for the Mercury in the 8th. Yes,
yeah, that's also
correct.
pretty.
That's correct.
To the point, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you say that was a turning point, because these are simply generic terms for things that might happen in these periods? So these are the words that Schmidt introduced: defining events and turning points.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, or is it not that specific?
Yeah, I would, and it also came to my mind during that time. That grandfather was my mother's father.
Okay.
It was like more of that, like ending of that.
Again, the 8th place is very strong, and we also talked about the The fourth place, of course, has to do with the grave, and that sounds a bit grave.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, nope. I just did something that was not what I intended to do. Yeah. Oh yeah, I was talking about the fourth place as having to do with the grave, which is a theme that runs through this very early period in your life, because it has to do with the death of your mother, of course, which is a very impactful event, of course. And again, the fourth place might have to do with endings. And also the period after endings, because well, that's the symbolism of the fourth place. So okay, and that might have also played a role in you turning to photography, but perhaps we need to talk about that further on. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now we come to the benefic third period, more benefic simply because there's a happy planet there and a happy planet ruling it, although it also has some issues. But okay, let's look at the first one. We come to the place where we find Venus, which is the ruler, of course, of the major period under the scales, under Libra. At age 39, this was perhaps a defining event for you.
39 under Libra. Okay. Scorpio. And that's the Scorpio period.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have anything on that. Did I give you any notes on that?
Nope.
Okay.
Nothing specific. We might come to the reason for that, but then let's look at the last period, because I took that one because, of course, the fishes is the image where Venus is exalted, and we find Jupiter there, and that, of course, these two planets working in tandem must have been a big boost, I think, because Jupiter is, of course, one of your best planets in the chart. Any ideas on that one?
Okay, Pisces in the Libra period. Yeah, the career came into focus again. Wanting to move up and better yourself. And my father died during that period.
Wow.
So more, and that's interesting. That's actually during that Pisces period.
Okay.
Oh, but Jupiter rules the sun, which is, I think of as father in my seventh.
Yeah. Okay. And also perhaps, well, the major issue, of course, is that the moon is in the fifth place, and the moon, of course, has a lot to do with people who are taking care of you. So nurturing, and people who are have your best interests at heart. And of course, the ruler of that place is Venus, being in the place of death, as related to a lot of fortune. So perhaps that is reaching for me, trying to find a meaning for that. But it might be that it still has such an impact, right? Yeah. Having to do with death. So, okay, as you said, and you wrote to me, focusing on career, you wanted to move up, but you had to start over because you lost your job, and that was pretty heavy for you, and a lot was placed on your shoulders at the time. Was this a period that you decided to not go further with photography?
That was getting close to when it seemed like I kind of came to a point where I could make a choice. Actually, when I lost my job, it was when I worked for my dad. I would say it was probably in that Capricorn period.
Yeah.
Under the Libra. That's actually, and that's when but I will say too, on that Pisces period, I was coming down to, it was towards the end of that photography. I was deciding I didn't think I wanted to try to do that as a full-time job anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, now let's have a look, because in the previous video, we were saying, Venus is, of course, in aversion to its own image, the scales, the period which we are talking about now. So we took Saturn as a chronometer for this entire period. So now we're going to have a look at whether or not Saturn itself had a very important principle, very important focus points or defining events in this period, because we were actually looking at the wrong ruler, if we can say it like that. I'm not quite sure, but let's have a look at the functioning ruler, the ruler by default, as I call it, which is the exaltation lord, which is of course Saturn. And then we come to the Capricorn period in 2004,
Yeah.
which would have been a defining event, I guess. And this is what you said, which is a lot. Because what you see now is that indeed the image where Saturn, the image that Saturn rules, the first time that it comes into play is in this period for 27 months, which is also a long period. And then you see all the things happening then. It has to do again with endings, because we're talking about the 8th place, which is the fortune 10th. So this is what you wrote. My father's company closed. Yeah. Can you tell me more about it? Because it's not nicely enumerated here, but perhaps you can.
Well, it was just, I kind of spoke about that a little earlier. I lost the company that I had worked for, I think for about 15 years.
Wow.
They decided to liquidate. I had to basically start over in my career. I had to take a job that was very, just to survive, I guess. I felt like, I had to just take anything. And so I had to just build my way back up. So that was kind of humbling. And my stepmother, my grandmother died during that period.
Okay.
Divorce, a second divorce.
Okay.
And by this time I had a child, which was even more difficult. I didn't have any children in my first marriage. A lot of, an overall sense of loss.
Yeah. Okay.
And death, more. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
So.
Pretty heavy period, I'm guessing.
Yeah. But I did meet my third husband, he's great.
Which is really good. Yeah.
So maybe that's that part you were talking about, a little bit of good and a little bit of bad in that third period,
Yeah, because Venus is, of course, in the 6th place, and it's in aversion to its own image, so that might indicate some instability of a certain period. And well, the interesting thing is that your Saturn is quite strong in the sense that it's in its own image. It's with the MC, so it's quite a stable planet. So that's interesting. And what makes the 8th house unstable is of course the location of Mercury there, because that's the planet keeping things up in the air. So that's how Schmidt described Mercury Hermes. So yeah. Okay, now so it's pretty clear that the alternative, or the chronometer by default, which is Saturn in this case for the scales for Libra, is certainly showing up a turning point, which is this period, which is pretty intense. But that also must mean that the period after this, which is the one of the water pourer, must also be very interesting. And we talked about that in a previous video, because there you said you came into your own, sort of, because this was the period that you bought a house, you started dating a guy, etc., which, very interesting.
Yeah, it felt more of a independent, rebellious sort of period, I guess.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Which modern astrologers would, of course, associate with Uranus being the modern ruler of this image.
Right.
But no, the traditional astrologer would say, well, that is because of Saturn being in its own image, the water pourer, and being in such a strong place and being such a self-sufficient planet. So, that's interesting. Yeah.
I think of Saturn and Aquarius too, kind of being outside the bounds, with Capricorn, beyond the bounds.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So this was a good period. So we can really say that the defining events have a lot to do with Saturn in this period, which is, of course, a very important principle. Use the the chronometer by default whenever the ruler of a certain image is in aversion to it. Try to find the other one, which is actually the manager of this image. That's a very important principle as well for this method. So, okay, so when we try to evaluate this complete period, I asked Holly, what would you bring forward as being the highlights of this entire sequence of events? Well, this is what Holly said. Well, the first period, of course, her mother's death, which is pretty self-explanatory, I think. This must have had a very big influence. Oh yeah, you got a step family, which is
Yeah.
also a very interesting development, I think. Must have been quite a change in your life.
Well, it was total. Yeah. Within a year after her death, and, a whole new family.
You got new
It's-
brothers and sisters.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
okay, wow.
Stepmother, three step siblings.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a lot.
Talk about sewing, right?
Gosh.
Okay, and your first boyfriend? Well, the first cut is the deepest. That's
Yeah.
it's a pretty song about this first period. Yeah. Okay, so now the second period. These were the highlights you mentioned for this period, which is going to college. Sort of logic, because Mercury is the planet ruling, but this is of course also very generic because people in these periods of life go to college at these ages. So that's sort of logic, but it's also interestingly associated with Mercury being the ruler of these 20 years of your life. First marriage, there was a divorce. Second marriage, birth of a child. Interesting. Was it a boy?
Yes.
Okay. The ancient texts say that Mercury often has to do with small boys.
Oh.
And Venus always has to do with little girls. But
Okay.
also, the Arabic astrologers said that Venus has to do with delicate children. That's interesting. But that's just an interesting thing I remembered from the Arabic texts. And that, of course, the second period was the beginning of your photography career. So interesting. So then we come to the harvest period, which is also a big period because a lot of things happened. It was a peak and the end of your photography career for now. I'm saying we talked about this. I think it would be a very good idea to try again having a go at this simply because, well, yeah, perhaps that's for our next talk about this, because we're going to talk about the sixth house in our next video, because you were also very kind enough to do a third video on your Zodiacal releasing, and then we're going to talk about you moving into the sixth place of the Scorpion and Venus there. So, but back to the third period of the scales, Libra. The death of 3 significant people in your life. That's also interesting. Your second divorce, your loss of a long-time job and security, and your third marriage. So when we try to see what Valens said, because he said, no, it was Schmidt who suggested, well, the angular image of a certain sequence of these zodiacal releasing periods is actually the main theme of everything happening in these 3 periods. So I wrote them in blue. It has to do with the father, children less so, but older persons, the persons who took over the role for your mother. What one does has to do with your job, the city where you live. Abiding has to do with your home. Changes of place, which were significant in your life. I've only heard of another person who moved, I think, 24 times in youth because her father was working at the railroad, so they had to move all the time. So she moved 24 times during her youth. So it was interesting. Well, death was certainly a very important principle in this in your life. Constraints having to do with things that constrain you in doing what you want to do. And of course, Valens said that the third place, goddess, has to do with the mother, which is, of course, even though she disappeared from your life pretty early on, she still, of course, plays a major role in them. So,
Mm-hmm.
so we could say indeed that yes, this principle of the angular place of a certain triad, house triad, has a very important significance for all the periods having to do surrounding this angular place of the fourth house. So that's interesting. Okay. So do you have anything to add? Because I'm thinking
I'm just thinking, boy, I captured all those topics.
yeah, you did, right? Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
that is so. Thank you again for allowing me to talk about this, because it's such a good example of that. Indeed, this works, and it's also quite dramatic in your life because your mother, the death of your mother, and that also highlights the very interesting but also quite negative influence of Mars being opposed also by Saturn
Yeah.
in your life. But happily, this only works in certain periods. We need to understand that one of the
Right.
big pluses of such a method like this, with activating certain periods, it's our principles, but they are not always continuously at work. So they, in certain periods of your life, they peak. Then we have peak periods, but not in the sense that I often read in Facebook posts, but simply they peak because several images are highlighting these planets, and then they come to a certain principle or something happening in a person's life. So I'm hoping
Yeah.
this is uh, illustrative for people trying to work with this. And again, I emphasize use all the periods when you have a certain event and try to understand what the logic is of all these periods in successive order, and the planets having a role in them. So,
And,
okay.
although it seems like, we focused on a lot of difficult things,
Mm-hmm.
but I would also say too, that it wasn't always difficult, even in these
Of course. Yeah.
difficult, and like you said, cycles change. It's good. You can see when they come to an end. Like, I'm really looking forward to my next one in a couple of years.
Yeah.
But even within these difficult ones, there's some
yeah.
good things too.
Of course, and we of course must. I should also have emphasized the fact that Jupiter is in opposition with the other angle which we are talking about, the Virgo period, because whenever there's an opposition from a benefic, that's a very good thing. And
Right.
Venus
And I've got a good one.
yeah, wow, yeah, you
Yeah,
got it. As I
it's like
said,
a blessing.
it's a double whammy, yeah.
Yeah.
With,
Yeah. I
with
think
Jupiter.
that's what helped me get through it all. Yeah, I
think
did.
so. Yeah, I think so too. There's a sort of inner, we call it,
Strength, faith.
right, strength. We call it. I cannot find the English word, but we call it veerkracht. Somebody having a strong spine, always being able to get up
Yes.
again.
And I've been told that. I've been
Okay,
told, people
yeah.
describe me that way. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
your chart and your life is evidence of it. So that's great, right? Yeah. Okay. So this is to be continued because, as I said, Holly was kind enough to also want to have a look at her next period, which is, of course, in the Scorpion, which is still going on at the moment, but within a year or two, it's going over into the very happy, very strong, and very good period of the Bowman, where she has the sun, which is finding your life work in a sense, because the complete period is then under the rule of the sun, and the sun is, of course, the ruler of a lot of the diamond. So that must be sort of an enlightening period. And Jupiter is also the dispositor, the ruler of the sun. So that's also activated in the 10th place, being in the fishes. So nothing bad can come from that, right?
Yeah, that'll be good.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it in the next video. But first, we're going to do the 6th house, the 6th place of her chart. So that's what's coming up for the next chart. So next video, I'm sorry. So thanks again, Harry, for giving all this information and talking about it, even though it was sometimes a pretty heavy stuff, especially the death of your mother. But yeah, I'm happy that you were kind enough to allow me to use your example. So thank you again.
For asking. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to stop the almost. First, I'm going to do some advertising. So whenever people would like this to have this for their own personal charts, you can get in touch with me, and then we're gonna have a nice talk about your chart and what happened in your life. So thank you again, and I'm gonna stop the recording now. Thank you, Holly, and see you next time.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye.